We do have another caller on the line if you want to go on to another topic.
Yes, please.
Pick that up.
All right, let's see. We have return caller Grok, continuing a call from last week, wants to talk about being trans. So let me go ahead and pick that one up. Grok, how are you doing? What do you want to talk about?
I would like to clarify some things that were talked about last week and continue with my point.
Sure. Yeah, we've got just about 10 minutes, and I want to make sure to kind of recap everything for anybody who wasn't watching last week. But I'll let you go ahead and jump in with the question if we can. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, and there was a little bit of a communication error since there's a delay. And so if I run on, just say excuse me, and I'll wrap up the sentence. But there was a misunderstanding as we were ending the conversation. I believe Kara and Christy both identified themselves as gray squares, and I just wanted to clarify that.
Sure.
In that analogy,
keep in mind, not everybody listening has heard the analogy. So just, gently, quickly as you can, if you can walk us through what you were maybe hoping or intending to say.
Okay. Well, the analogy given was a machine that makes black or white squares, and then somehow a gray square is produced. So in that analogy, I was speaking about biological sex, and I don't know you or Kara or Christy if you are intersex, but that's what the gray square in that analogy is intersex. It was strictly biological, chromosomal kind of a.
I think we got that, but I think a problem with the analogy is that biological sex is not a thing, right? Like just saying XX or XY chromosomes does not actually describe accurately the majority of people. So it's problematic in that regard. And I still am not really sure what this machine is or where it's coming from. Like you say, you have a machine that makes black squares and white squares, and then you tell me it made a gray square. So it sounds like you got a machine that makes black squares, white squares, and gray squares. Just help me understand maybe what you were trying to explain, even if we put the metaphor aside.
Okay. Let's address the statement that you made about there not being such thing as a biological sex.
We've covered that on the show a whole bunch. Do you have a question about it?
I know that there is variation amongst people in general. So I wouldn't go as far as to say that biological sex does not exist based on the fact that there is variation.
I've talked to biologists about it on this show, though, and they say that it doesn't exist. And we've documented that really well. So I don't mean to cut you off, Grok, and I don't mean to be at all persnickety here, but this is really, really important. This is not a, both sides have good points kind of notion. I'm not specifically a geneticist or a particular expert on this subject, but I'm telling you that we've talked to experts on this subject. I've got links that I can show you in the show notes for this episode. And I just want to be really clear that their notion of biological sex is really, really blurry and inaccurate. You can base your concepts of biological sex, if you want to, on gamete size. You can base it on hormones. You can base it on chromosomes. You can base it on facial features if you really want to. But all of those things are incredibly, incredibly squishy. Maybe the best way to describe this idea is something Boris Valkai said when we talked about it with him, when he pointed out that, you and I both know what a, quote, fish is. We have a concept of what a fish is. But if you go and ask a biologist, hey, what's a fish? Or start to read the definition of fish in a biological dictionary, you're going to see something that is full of exceptions and is really weird and detailed and complicated and messy. And it sure as shit is not as simple as yes, fish or not a fish. There's tons of debate and questions among experts about, quote, where we should draw the line. But the answer is always going to be somewhere. right? It's just not it's a very fuzzy concept, and that applies here too. The notion that biological sex is binary is just not grounded in science or reality.
Yeah, go ahead.
So men and women aren't fish. Males and females are not fish. And sex is, biologically, we would say that a species that produces sexually has one side and another side. And those two sides come together to sexually reproduce. So that's what I mean by biological sex, that there is
biology experts don't say that, Grok.
And a female gamete, and they come together.
So here's the thing about that. I think sometimes it can be troublesome for people when they hear something like, well, biological sex doesn't exist. Well, what do we mean by that? It doesn't mean that there's no such thing as a person that is identified as a man or as a woman or whatever. But what it means is that we've kind of taken this concept of biological sex, and that's something that we thought of, right? We use that to describe what we see in the world, but it's a little bit of a mental shortcut because the world is pretty complex. There are a lot of things that exist in nature, and we tend to like to categorize things, right? And put things into boxes. And we have these two really convenient boxes that a lot of people like to use for biological sex that are male and female. And those can be really useful. For example, when you're explaining to a child, where do babies come from, or something like that, we might refer to these boxes that we've come up with. But the problem with any kind of mental shortcut like that and category that we create to try and squish the world into is that it doesn't always work 100% of the time. It may be helpful to describe some things, but it isn't perfect. It isn't an exact match to what exists in nature. And so there are always going to be some exceptions in some ways that model doesn't exactly describe reality. And that doesn't mean that it's not useful sometimes, but the problem can happen when we come upon these exceptions, and rather than recognizing that the model doesn't perfectly describe reality, but instead we try to say, oh, well, that piece of reality must not exist then because it doesn't fit my imperfect model. But that's thinking about it in sort of the backwards kind of way. Does that make sense at all?
Well, that just goes to the point that there are variations among people. Just because, somebody's 6 foot and somebody's 5 foot, that they're somehow intrinsically different other than literally just their physical height. So I'm not talking about individual variations amongst people, because some people have big noses, some people have brown eyes, some people have blue eyes. That's not relevant. And those exceptions you're talking about don't apply, I would say, to humans. And on the planet, I don't think there's any sexually trimorphic species, such as there is a male, a female, and some other sex that would, interact in some way to reproduce. So biologically, there is a male and a female, and those male and female cells come together. And, we've identified males and females in all sorts of species, just like Homo sapiens can be identified as apes. We look at the traits of a person, and we can determine, what those traits mean. So a male would be, XY chromosome, and they would have penis and testicles and produce sperm. So
what about all of the males that don't have XY chromosomes and that don't produce sperm or have testes? What do you do with those people?
I believe you're referring
How do you fit them into your model?
That's an intersex person.
Yeah, I'm wondering what is it about that you said doesn't apply? What do you mean by that?
I mean that we have classifications, right? So Pluto was once classified as a planet.
Who's we though, Grok? I'm trying to hold you to this a little bit, because
humans
when
in
you say
general.
we, you're not
Humans.
speaking on behalf of the scientific community as I understand it, and as relative experts on the subject have documented it. So when you say we,
Okay.
would it be okay for you to say, I don't accept people as being anything other than male and female?
I'm saying in order to function in society, we have to come to agreements about what words mean. And back to my point of Pluto used to be identified as planet, and then we discovered a bunch of Pluto-like objects in the outer solar system. So we changed the designation for what Pluto is. So it's no longer classified as a planet, it's classified as an exoplanet. So if we look at a intersex person, we classify them as an intersex person. There's no need to say that male is some nebulous idea that, you know, every human has to be able to fit into. No, we just changed the classifications, and now we have males, females, and intersex.
But not all intersex people are going to meet any specific criteria, and neither are male people or female people. There's no single line that you can draw that says, if you have this component, then you are a woman. There are plenty of women who don't meet any criteria you might select, and that's okay. And I guess what I really hoped you would realize, Grok, after having had a week to sit on this, is that the information that we understand as a society, as a scientific community, doesn't line up with the model that you've been taught. And I'm hearing you say over and over and over again, it should be this way, it needs to be this way, it makes sense to me this way, but I'm not hearing you really quote any meaningful studies. I'm not hearing you really talk about these scientific considerations that we have tried really hard to explain and express on this show. And I'll tell you what, I would love to have you maybe take a look at some of the episodes that we've done where people other than Kara and I have answered this question in more detailed ways. When we've talked to biologists and researchers and chemists and a number of different types of people, if I can put some of that in front of you and you find something disagreeable, something that you can track down in the Merck manual as being inaccurate, I would love to hear about that from you. I don't want to have a single piece of misinformation on this show to the best of our abilities, but I'm telling you just as simply and as plainly as I can, I'm not an expert, but I've learned from some brilliant people and I've read some really good books and they disagree with you. So I need you to take a look at that information before you just tell me this is the way things are or the way things should be. Is that all fair?
Well, if we can just address specifically what you've claimed. Your claim is that male is a spectrum. And what I'm saying to that is that there are variations amongst people. A variation in a person, genetically, physically, psychologically, that variation does not change a classification. Some cars have 4 wheels. Some cars have 6 wheels. We do not have a different classification for cars based on how many wheels it has. It's just a car or a vehicle or, you know, however you want to put it.
What's the classification for maleness? Let's just cut to that there. If you can tell me all males are X, then we'll have a category that we can reliably use. But I'm telling you, you're not going to be able to find an X that actually works. What is the line that you would like to draw?
When I've already said that males have, or well, I should say male Homo sapiens have XY chromosomes. They have a penis, they have testicles, and they produce male gametes. That's what a male is. And if you fall outside of that definition, then you are either a female or you are intersex. And if you have a variation within that definition, then you are just a different variant of a male. It does not make you a different thing than a male. You are just a taller male, you're a shorter male, you're a darker male, a lighter male. you're a male with blue eyes.
Or a
Like,
female
they're all
or an
variations that are
intersex
genetic.
person, a category which seems to include everybody who doesn't fit into your two-box system.
Yeah, I feel like
Which
again,
is
we're kind of slipping back and forth in between saying that we're describing reality and then saying that we must make reality to conform to our model of it. And those are,
no,
in
this is
fact,
biological
two
function.
very different things. We created the
Can a
model.
female and a
It's
female make a baby?
intended to describe reality, but if we discover that it doesn't, I think the thing that I would want to do first is examine, well, if my model doesn't match reality, maybe I need to adjust my model, not adjust reality.
Mhm.
That's a little bit more difficult to do the second one. I'm going to actually recommend a book as well, by a physical anthropologist. And what I love about physical anthropology is that it's one of those fields that kind of takes the social and the biological and kind of considers them together, which, in my opinion, is a very important thing to do, especially when we're talking about slippery concepts like sex and gender. And there's a book called Race, Monogamy, and Other Lies They Told You by Augustine Fuentes. And I know that sex and gender is not in the title of it, but it has a really good chapter on this that kind of goes into some of the details and some of the ways that what we might have learned in school about these sort of oversimplified models isn't actually a good representation of reality. So that might be another place to kind of look for some of the resources that we're talking about. See if that helps, or if maybe you don't agree with that or don't think that it comports with other studies that you've seen. But that
Yeah.
might be a good starting point.
All models are wrong. Some
just
models
trying
are
to-
useful. Grok, let me say this. We offered to give you 10 minutes. We're actually a little bit over time because we've been talking for 15 minutes now. I'm going to ask that you take a look at one of the episodes that I will make sure to include in the show notes of this episode, or if you prefer to maybe look at the book chapter that Kara is referring to. After you've taken a look at that, if you would like to tell us where we're wrong, tell us what we've misunderstood, send us an email. We will gladly read that on air. We will talk to you about it, and we'll do everything we can to help clear this up for you. But we've spent a pretty good amount of time, I think, circling the same material here. So if we may, I think it's time for us to begin to wrap up the show for the night.